Well, first off, thank you, Edith, Dr. Khan, for letting the language and brain group the invitation. It's some of my favorite stuff to do is share research and talk about research, not necessarily presenting, but talk about it. Um, and in the past, I think the last time I gave a talk at the lab group, it was at the VA hospital, and we were doing work at that point in creativity. And I looked back when that was published, and because of the feedback we got from that paper has been cited like 200-300 times now. So it was that sort of collaboration, talking to people is really valuable, and I just love being able to do it. And sometimes UF gets so big you can't, and so this is a really nice opportunity, and my door is always open, and my email is always responded to. Um, so in my abstract, I mentioned the lab has two research goals. One is exploring fundamental cognitive processes that are related to learning, so memory, attention, problem solving, reading comprehension, and then trying to use those to work on furthering our theory of understanding of cognitive science. But another part of my work is actually applying this knowledge in educational settings and places where we can make learning better. And you'll see that sort of theme throughout. Um, I originally grew up in Maine, and I didn't know if folks know this, but Maine is the most rural state of all the United States. And I was in a town of 1,800 people. And when I was growing up, you could be three things. You could be a fisherman, you could work at the yard where you made basically ships for the Navy, or you could do trade school or carpentry. And my mom said to me at the time, she said, if you don't want to do those things, you need to stay in school. So it was no surprise when I was doing my postdoc in my late 20s, early 30s, my mom called me up and she'd say, Sweet pea, that's what she called me. So, you don't have to stay in school forever. It's time for you to get a real job. And that's about the time I started at UF. And one of the things that you'll see is sort of this pragmatic approach to my work. And I hope you guys can appreciate that. So this is the folks that are working in my lab right now. Is that good? Okay, there it is. So we have five members in the lab right now. Daniel and Bowen are our graduate research assistants. And we don't have a formal educational psychology degree. So all these folks that work with me because they want to volunteer or they are interested in doing the work, but there's no formal degree. So I'm a cognitive psychologist in education, but probably more better placed in psychology, so to speak. So Daniel is finishing his MA in mental health counseling. He's been with me since 2019, and I'm happy to report he's actually working as a first author on a paper that we started exploring on webcam proctoring and academic basically dishonesty. So how that affects people's performance and the issues related to that since the pandemic. Another graduate student working in my lab is Bowen Wang, who is in research evaluation and methodology, and he is basically interested in psychometrician type things and educational measurement. And so he is just finishing his quals right now. For undergraduates working with us, we have Karina, who wants to be a pediatric neuropsychologist, and she's getting her degree in psychology and also a minor in ed studies. Takuma, who is essentially in his last year, he's a triple major with cognitive neuroscience, biology, and Japanese. He's also a superstar tennis player. He's like a 4.5. I think 6.0 is professional. He's very accomplished. And then the last person to join our lab most recently is Nithya, and she is basically pursuing a degree in economics and statistics. And we're happy to invite her, and she just started work like this semester. So we have a very eclectic group, and I like the strength of how eclectic it is. And we wouldn't be anywhere without these folks helping me out. So I always want to be thankful, and it's just a lot of fun. Lab meetings are some of like my favorite times over the years, and a lot of people have been through the lab and stories about where they end up and what they end up doing. So, okay. With regard to the outline for the talk, I'm glad that Edith laid it out the way she did, because that's how I understood to do it. So I feel like I've done my task. So I'm going to give you sort of a whirlwind tour of types of topics that we've been interested in my lab, and the methodology and sort of the accompanying procedures. And then also like just some of my thoughts about generally the research process as I've understood it with regard to like lab management, reflections on grants, and sort of the changing of the publishing landscape at the end of the talk. So I'm not going to present, I'll present probably a lot of material, but I'm not going to present a lot of depth. And I hope that's okay, but I'm happy to talk more about these things, but just sort of get an idea of what we're doing. And then if people are interested, to then engage in collaborations. So, okay. So, and for each of these areas, I'll give you sort of an origin story of how it started. So, this first line of work, I think, is kind of representative of the type of stuff I'm interested in. Back in the early 2000s, there was a lot of work essentially re-envisioning what was called the testing effect. And this was, folks who may be familiar, this was basically Rodiger's work and his student Karpicki. And the idea of the testing effect is essentially that you gain long-term retrieval by being active in your thinking about that material, right? So how this is done is typically in these experiments is you get a paragraph, you read a paragraph, and they're going to test you on it. And in the condition, which is the testing effect, or what they call retrieval practice now, because testing is considered pejorative, you would essentially try to write down everything you can remember. So in one of these experiments, you would get a paragraph on mustelids. You would get a paragraph on sea otters, and it would tell you about where they live, about their fur, the environment around them, what they eat, those sorts of things. You try to remember as much as you could about this, this paragraph. And then they would say, okay, you got 7 minutes. And then after you got done reading it, you put it aside. They gave you a blank piece of paper and say, for 7 minutes, write as much as you can about this. And then afterwards, you would take an exam. They would compare that to, here it is for 7 minutes, put it aside for a moment. Here you have another 7 minutes to read it. And they looked at the performance between those two. And there's a dramatic difference between those two. When you're engaged in essentially trying to actively recall the information without it being there, there's something different about the learning processes that makes those connections stronger, right? So the argument is for why the retrieval practice works is that when we use our memories to retrieve things, we change our access to those things and they become more recallable in the future. So you're basically practicing what you're going to be doing when you do the exam, right? But when I was reading all this stuff, because it became super popular, like, well, my concern was this: nobody studies like that. Nobody gets a paragraph and then writes recall exactly what's on that paragraph. So I was thinking to myself at the time, like, maybe we should do this and think about how students actually study, right? So what you see on the right here is actually a procedure for experiment that we ran a few years back and has been sort of the beginning of some of this work that now is being applied. So in this particular approach, what we did is we thought, well, how do students actually study, and can that be rolled into this idea of retrieval practice? So we have the original, I guess, can you guys see my cursor? Yes, no?
Yes.
Okay, great. So you have basically the same materials that Rodiger and Karpicki used, where you would read this paragraph, and then we'd use fillers to try and deal with issues of short-term memory and well, it's beyond this, but and then you would do your traditional test free recall, where you would write down what it is you remember on a blank piece of page, or just read it again. And then we would have them do it again, but we'd have them do things that were more like what students would do in a classroom, right? So, and Dunlowski has done this work too. Like, what do we think students actually do when they study? Almost all the time, they just reread their lecture notes and book chapters and articles and nothing else. That's the predominant way to study, right? Which we know now is less effective than the testing effect and less effective than others, right? We also looked at free recall, which was essentially the testing effect or retrieval practice, but we included some of our own conditions, and these were practice quizzing, test generation, or keyword. So practice quizzing would be like, at the end of all the textbooks, there are practice quizzes. You would engage in those. That's going to help you study. That's a form of basically retrieval practice. Test generation is one that I was hoping was going to come out, but the idea is you would basically write your own materials to create a quiz, and that would help you to study. Or a keyword method, which would be like akin to flashcards. And so then we would run people through these, and then they would come back 7 days later, like you would perhaps in a class. You get your lecture, you study, you come back, there's going to be a quiz. And I won't take you through all the results, but I'll take you through here. Three numbers I think are important, okay? So if you look at how students actually study, that's basically reading it and reading it and reading it. Their performance on this exam. Now, remember, it's not going to be great because it's 7 days in the future, and it's the case that that they had minimal time, and they were graded on. I think it was 21 questions, and they were multiple choice and short answer, and it was partial credit, so they could get a score out of 35. So reading only, students do about 40%. If you do the traditional testing condition, which is where you try to recall everything and write it down, students were about 50%. You got a 10% gain, right? So again, this is all experimental, and so there's issues about that. But if you graded in practice quizzing, this is where we gave them basically a multiple choice test on elements of the paragraph, but it was different than their final test that they took. They actually did another 8% better. It's almost 20% better than just reading only. So we have here evidence that we can engage in something that kids already do in college, practice quizzing, and it makes more sense in terms of employing that in like a classroom, right? So this sat for a while. This is we published this in 2019. I think it's cited 72 times. So people are paying attention to the practice quizzing. We weren't the only people doing this sort of stuff. Another faculty member, McDaniels, was doing this as well. But I had the opportunity, and this is what's great about collaborations. Someone came to see me from chemistry, and they were thinking about trying to employ some measures that would help with some of their courses where like they would weed out courses and performance was an issue. So we developed essentially a plan to incorporate practice testing, retrieval practice, in a way that would help folks in their chemistry. Now, this hadn't been done because chemistry is a very different thing, right, than learning about mustelids. And what we did here was essentially create a set of, I think it was 4 retrieval practice quizzes, but you would get the practice quizzes after you had actually taken your during term exam. So it didn't help you prepare for the exam. It helped you basically after the exam to sort of consolidate the material, right? So one of the things we were concerned about, because this is now a quasi-experimental design, right? People could either do this or not. And this was one of the issues we ran into with chemistry, is that they were given like 1 percentage point extra credit for doing this. So 80% of the people did it. And then so many people wanted to do it that we didn't have a very good control condition, which is problematic. But it was good because I'll show you later that it was effective. So what we wouldn't want to see is basically that the retrieval quiz practice performance is actually driven by how they do on the during term exams, right? Because then you're dealing with people let's say they do very well on the during term exam and they say, well, I don't want to participate because I did well, and they select out of it. Then you have basically differences in participation as a function of how they're doing on the different exams, right? So you want none of the differences to happen there across the during term exams. But what I'm interested in is, can we actually improve their scores on the final exam? And so in this instance, this is referred to as the forward testing effect, because it's not just, can you read a paragraph about mustelids and then reproduce that? It's like, can you learn concepts in chemistry and then actually use those in a new context, given your understanding? And so this next slide shows you, if I can get to it, the results. So in this, I'm going to move my view for people so I can see, give me. There's no differences across the during term exams and the actual application of the practice retrieval test. But in the final exam, people who, and these are their levels of participation, low, moderate, and high. And there is a significant difference between the people who participated, did more of these quizzes than the people who did less. And it basically came out to be almost a full letter grade, right? And so that was kind of a big deal. Now we have a quasi-experimental design where we can show that just incorporating these tests, and remember, these are 4 different quizzes. There's only 12 questions on each of them, over the course of an entire semester. So I think that's pretty decent. The next thing that happened is I got a call from psychology, and we started some work over there. And in that instance, basically, we were looking at an already existing setup. In psychology, it's the largest major on campus. They have 300 people every semester or more. They have 6 TAs that help teach courses of 30 or so. And they have a setup where they have basically a midterm and final exam, but some of these chapter exams, and they've incorporated practice tests into the actual online courses. And they're typically taken from books. They aren't even as well constructed as they would be to the material they may be using, because they don't simply use the book exams. And we're looking at like how they utilize these practice exams, because they could take them multiple times. How many times do they take them? How they did on the first time, and basically how those things are linked to their performance on exams throughout the semester. And what we found was, these things are related, and this is done in real time. This is done before they take the exams. And we see these relationships. We presented this at a conference in psychology this past summer. And now what we're moving this work is basically, okay, we know this works in an experiment. We know that it works in terms of conceptually for people for their final exams. We know it works in practice for folks when we haven't really, done a lot. And this is pre-existing data for which we didn't, make any manipulations. So one of my goals now is to take this and to create basically an AI-driven practice algorithm so that we can look at people's performance and then tailor essentially what retrieval practice would be based on what they got right and wrong. And so you see this, I mean, it's already exists in terms of computer adaptive testing, tutoring, personalized education. But my guess is that we will be able to provide sort of like a type of tutoring that can be specific to a student's learning for things they have difficulty with, but doesn't require the instructor to be doing that part. So you can get people up in terms of their disciplinary knowledge using this sort of approach. And there's, Carpicki has done a lot of this already sort of commercially. They're starting to do this, but I thought it'd be really interesting to try this in psychology. And so we're working on that currently. So you can see there, so most of the stuff that I start with starts empirically, and then it goes off the rails into more applied, okay? Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is essentially some work in engineering that I've been doing. And this is all NSF funded work. And I was very fortunate early in my career for folks say, well, we're looking for somebody in cognition. And I ended up meeting people in civil and materials engineering and also qualitative researchers. And we ended up exploring basically ambiguity in problem solving in engineering. And so the first grant we wrote, it was about essentially what are the differences between experts and novices in engineering, how they approach problem and how they handle things where they don't know the answers, right? Where it's ambiguous, there's multiple paths to solutions, or there's uncertainty. And that was a lot. It was a lot of fun. And then we, published and kind of stopped doing it. And then when I was on sabbatical, my colleague Elliot Douglas and I were having lunch. And he said, we should do another one. I said, I don't want to. I said, because the problem with ambiguity is we just don't have a good characterization of it, right? It's like creativity. It's very difficult to study. It's nebulous. We tried. It worked out well. We got some interesting results, but I don't feel confident about creating experiments. And he said, well, you know what? You should write a grant that basically does that. We should get a taxonomy of ambiguity. And I said to him, yeah, I can do that, but I guarantee you won't get funded. So I was on sabbatical at the time, and I thought, okay, let's do this. And we did, and it did get funded. And what I'm presenting to you now is essentially that line of work. And this hasn't been published yet. We're sending it in. So forgive the rough draft quality, but this is what we did. So in this particular grant, we had experts in civil engineering and students in engineering, and we had them come in, and it was this is a qualitative approach, right? They all interviews. And we had folks, and we used what's called artifact elicitation. And in that, you bring a problem with you to the interview. And so we asked the students, bring something that you found particularly ambiguous. And we did the same thing for basically folks that were civil engineering experts that had spent more than 20 years in the field. And we had like an hour interview with them where we had scripted questions. We asked them things like, what makes this ambiguous? What would make it easier for you? What do you see are the elements of this? And then we engaged in a grounded theory analysis. And this is going to be the other folks in the grant because I'm not as much of an expert in qualitative research. But what came out of this was essentially this model right here. And so what we found out is that technical ambiguity, which is the application of math, science, and engineering principles, is at the heart of what causes problems for engineers when things are ambiguous or there are multiple path solutions or things are uncertain or unclear, right? But that there are these other periphery that are important that they really struggle with, and that a lot of people talked about. So discourse was the use of language in contracts, for instance, interpersonal interactions between people working on a problem, the roles they may have, interpersonal, which is the idea that ambiguity comes from characteristics of the problem solver. And this is really important because problems aren't ambiguous. People think problems are ambiguous, and people approach problems in different ways. They're the ones who actually experience the ambiguity. We also had sort of a grab bag category, which is non-technical, which includes things like professional skills, ethics, finance, politics. And then the only difference between the student and the expert models, and the student is on the left here, and the expert is on the right here, is instructional. So our students also made comments about basically their interactions with professors and class assignments in terms of ambiguity. And so we've collected all of this, and I'm excited about this now because I'm writing a grant where we're going to use this to create conditions around how engineers um, think about and approach problems. And the reason for this is essentially that in that area and that discipline, there's a huge chasm between academic preparation for engineers and the profession of engineers and what they're able to do. And in some engineering companies, they won't let a new engineer touch anything that's a project until they've been through their own internship or till they've basically apprenticed with folks to get a sense of how different real work is from academic work. And so one of the next things I'll show you is an offshoot of that work. We got a supplemental grant. Elliot and I were sitting there again. This wasn't at lunch, but we were talking about this grant, and we were talking about trying to create ambiguous situations from statics problems. Statics problems are essentially how engineers understand force on members and how it changes the shape of things and breaks things and things along those lines. It's his entire class. And we were looking through the textbook and we were like, well, all these questions seem very, very similar. How are folks going to learn how to handle things that are more complex if the questions all kind of follow the same form? And basically I said to him, like, well, we can't be sure of that. So we ended up writing a grant asking for engineering undergraduate students who are basically transitioning to graduate school to help us. And what we did is we did a descriptive analysis of basically engineering textbooks. And we did the two most popular textbooks based on Amazon sales, because you can't get that. And we had them code all of the end of problems for the chapters for these textbooks. Okay. And what we did was we essentially laid out the problems in a way of, I guess a way to think about it would be like Bloom's taxonomy, right? You go from very simple recalling to being able to apply to being able to provide sort of an assessment or what have you. This is in engineering problem-solving taxonomy that's used by Jonathan, where taxonomy means that it starts simple and then it gets more complex and it's dependent on the thinking above it. So the easiest approach would be logical, where you're applying a specific method of reasoning. The most difficult will be a dilemma, developing possible approaches to a situation with no definitive solution, and I can't say it, irreconcilable perspective, sorry. And so you kind of see the progression here through of difficulty. And you would expect people in engineering to have to deal with troubleshooting, diagnosing solutions, meeting goals in a complex system. This fits with what they ought to be able to do. So we went and had folks do that analysis, and this is what we found. And this was across 2 textbooks and over 3,000 problems. So the undergraduates, Emma and Annie, did an awesome job with this. And, I don't have it here, but the Kappa, we all met to make sure with agreement. Almost all problems in statics textbooks across 2 of the most well-used textbooks in engineering are all algorithmic, which is the second level and some of the least complex types of problems. The others were logic. There were no other problems. And so that was one of those things where we can understand why there is a disconnect in engineering between what people ought to be able to do in the real world and what's going on with sort of their academic training. In addition, I was interested in some of the cognitive stuff about how we describe concepts in text and using it as sort of a learning guide. So if I go back here for a minute, you'll see this, and this deals with folks who may be familiar with embodied cognition and some of the design issues that occur. And what you can see here are the top row are examples of affordances, and the bottom row examples of embodiments. So an affordance is essentially where you know how to interact with an object because you have some sense of it, right? It's intuitive that this is a wrench, and that gives you information about how to solve that problem. And I would argue that makes that a much easier problem to solve and conceptually a better way to underpin it than this. So I actually asked an engineer, like, what is this? And his response, well, it doesn't matter. I just need to answer it, right? And so what we're looking towards is trying to find partnerships with folks in terms of what they're creating for their content to see if we can make this a little bit more approachable for students. Similarly, embodiment is the idea that you can have physically a presence or the representation of a presence that helps you to understand how something works. In this case, you can see this hand right here. And this hand gives you information basically about like how the forces would be used, how much force you would use, the direction of things, that sort of stuff. This probably does as well, but not in the same way. And so one of the things we can do is we can rely on what we know about modeling, embodiment, affordances to try and make some of these things a little bit easier. So that was another part of that project. So that was descriptive. And you can see here with our results that affordances in engineering are actually tools and things that people know about intuitively. They use them, but oftentimes we see there's no object where there could be one, or there's an object where there's no intuitive understanding. Embodiment isn't used at all. That's not necessarily a surprise, but it could be. And oftentimes we see pictures of people, they're irrelevant to the actual engineering. And these are missed opportunities where we could help people in their understanding of basically their apprenticeship in engineering. Okay, so let me transition now off of the grants to basically a pandemic project. And this is, I think, Edith will appreciate this. Lisa Abrams and I, who is the former chair of psychology for a while and been in psychology for a long time, moved to Pomona a few years back. And for some reason, we ended up in contact and we decided, oh, we're going to do a study. And one of the things we were concerned about at that time, we were going to this, the high flex. I don't know if people still have nightmares about the approach of trying to teach in that environment and such. And so we were concerned about basically academic performance and anxiety and working memory and how students were managing that. So we thought, well, it'd be interesting if we could conduct a study that looked at those sorts of things. So initially what we ended up doing was creating a study where we were measuring working memory, and we wanted to try to reduce stress and show that they would perform better on another working memory span task, right? So a working memory span task, for people who don't know, and probably everybody does, is essentially a dual task that requires you to do two things at once, and they tend to be very, very cognitively demanding, right? So we were thinking about like what ways can we help to reduce anxiety for students, and we were kind of through several meetings talking about this, and we came up with ideas everybody would probably. It was we could use meditation, breathing, exercise. We could use basically humorous videos. And one of the things we ran up against is like if we're trying to do an online experiment, these things they aren't really decent for trying to do manipulations because they're long. Some of them require groups. And for humor, for instance, what's funny to someone may not be funny at all to another person, right? So we were trying to struggle with that, and I came up with this idea. I said, well, what if we just have people think about laughing? She's like, well, what do you mean? So what we did is we ended up creating stimuli, and we had people rate people that were laughing, and they would listen to it, and they would rate basically how pleasant it was, how much it captured their attention, how arousing it was, and then after that, that would be sort of our manipulation to see if it reduced their anxiety. And what we found in the first sort of pilot studies, I did a bunch of these on MTurk, which I will advise folks that if you want to do anything serious on MTurk, just don't. If you want to do surveys, spectacular, but if you want to do actual experimental work, please don't. It just doesn't work well.
Use Prolific instead.
Yeah, and even Prolific, we had some issues, but it was better for sure. And we use PsychoPy and oh gosh, what's the interface for PsychoPy? Pavlovia for some of it too. I use Inquisit mostly for everything now, but at any rate, so what we found is working memory did not change at all. It's stressful, it's hard, and people engaged in the laughing manipulation didn't actually change their performance. But what was really interesting is that the laughing manipulation, when we measured anxiety, changed that considerably. And we were like, well, wait a minute. So we created a second study, and what I'm presenting to you now is the second study, and it's kind of interesting, and I'll kind of provide some context after we get done with it. But okay, so here it is. So we used in the original study, we used 8 questions from the state trait anxiety inventory. It has 40, and we found that basically stress was reduced. But we're like, we need to use the full scale, and we need to basically like figure out what's going on here. So this is a second, third iteration of some pilot work. And then we had them engaged in 3 conditions. This is all online, and this is done at well, some of it was done at UF, some was done at Pomona. No, this is all actually all done at UF. And all done in Inquisit, all done online. So people would fill out the 40 questions state trait anxiety inventory. And then they either engaged in a symmetry span task, which is a working memory span task, which people find I like it, but people find it very stressful. You have to basically decide if something is asymmetrical or not, and remember where the place is of a red dot in a series of grids, and then report that out, okay? And then you could be in that condition. You could be in the laughter sounds condition where you rate it for pleasantness, arousal, and how funny it was. or a neutral condition is rated for pleasantness and arousal. And I actually match these for pleasantness. So neutral sounds could be things like the photocopier or a bubbler or a lawnmower. And then for laughter sounds, we had a range of different laughter sounds. We had like a Santa laugh. We had IADS, which is a database for sounds that we used. We actually tried to get additional stimuli from folks who've done this work in neurocognition. So they take the stay, they're in one of these three conditions, and they take the stay again. And what we found was, not a surprise, if you engage in a working memory span task, it stresses you out. You actually can see here after the intervening task, the stress levels go up, they're significant. And the neutral sounds, it doesn't change at all. There's no significant difference. But if you listen to laughter sounds, it decreases your stress level, and that is significant. But what's most interesting about this is, remember, the state trait anxiety inventory is state and trait. There's another part. State you expect, because state is what's happening to you at the moment. Trait should never change, right? Well, trait is significant. If you listen to laughter sounds and you answer the questions about your traits, that is how generally anxious you are as a person, you find a significant difference here that basically trait anxiety decreases. And so I thought to myself, this can't be right. We must have screwed up the programming. So I went through everything and the data, and then we reran another copy of this over at Pomona, and we came up with the same result. I've seen this in one other study in working memory training where they managed to achieve this through 2 or 3 weeks of training, and it was like an hour a day. We don't know if this particular effect will last for 30 seconds, but the fact that it actually exists is really interesting, and we're trying to figure out like what that means. So this particular work could be characterized as experimental, but we found something novel, and we're trying to grapple with the theoretical underpinning. And the issues we're dealing with this particular study is it's in between fields, right? So state trait anxiety and emotion, that's in personality, which neither Lisa and I do. The cognitive stuff, while it's interesting, isn't as applicable because working memory, you expect what's going to happen. And we don't know exactly why this is happening. There's some thoughts from both of us. This is like part of the what's called the undoing hypothesis, that the laughing creates sort of a reset in your physical system. And there's some neurological evidence from Lisa Scott about that as well. But that's beyond my skill set right now. So this is sort of a fun piece of work that we're following up. And we may we're currently doing this also, looking at this in sort of creativity. And trying to see if there's any links there. So that's another area of work. And the last one, how am I doing on time? Okay, I don't know. Okay, we're pretty good.
Yeah,
Okay,
we're okay.
okay. I cut out a bunch. I'm glad. So the next part I'm going to spend a little bit more time on because I think it's more interesting for folks in linguistics generally. And I'll talk about the work I've done sort of in pseudoscience and also misinformation and disinformation. And this work came about, the origin story for this is Brian Zabowski and I. He was a former graduate student in school psychology, and he was in my office, and I was helping him with another study he was working on, and we were grousing about basically, pseudoscience that happens that we have to deal with, like, eye tracking, desensitization work that's done in clinical realms. He was talking about like vests and autism, and so we were like, what'd be interesting is we started to do a study on this, and then we came up with basically an approach that looked at pseudoscience and the application of science. And I'm going to talk about this as like the syntax of science. So what is pseudoscience? Pseudoscience is basically it is false claims that wrap itself in science. And it does that by basically saying that it has equipment, it has a theory, it creates the impression that it's reliable. Probably the best example of pseudoscience, and I'm sure you guys know about this, is phrenology. Phrenology was in the 1800s. There were 37 faculties, as they called them, and they were used to basically justify all kinds of awful decisions people made. So just as this little thought experiment here, if you go behind your ear and feel any bumps there, anybody feel any bumps? No? That's
Those
good.
are mastoids.
That is your area. I don't know if you can see it in here. That is your area for destructiveness. So just be aware. Okay. So this is sort of like, and it has what's called the Forer effect, right? People can see themselves in this sort of stuff in the same way we see ourselves in horoscopes and fortune cookies and other things, right? But like, how would we say this is relevant? This is 200 years ago. Well, I would argue that this stuff is super relevant now, and for these reasons, right? Why should we care? Because 20% of Americans don't know that the Earth revolves around the sun. Okay. 10% still believe the Earth is flat. We have a lot of folks that are engaged in science denialism. So that evolution doesn't exist. There's no such thing as climate change. In education, we deal with this quite regularly. I'll talk a little bit more about learning styles. Learning styles is the idea that my preferred learning style should be attended to. And as a faculty member, if I match my teaching style to your learning style, that's going to be your best learning. Totally false. No evidence for it whatsoever. Now, you can have a preference, that's fine, but they've actually shown evidence to suggest that depending on the actual content of the material, the teaching methodology should follow that, not what your preferences are. Also, probably the most famous ones of these are harmful medical practices. I'm sure folks are aware of the Wakefield study, right? Maybe yes.
Nah, remind us.
Okay, so the Wakefield study was essentially the study where a doctor in the UK decided that there was a link between vaccinations, MMR vaccinations, and autism. And so he published this thing in the Lancet, and you can take a wild guess how many participants he used. It was 12. And he said 8 of these people developed autism. Consequently, no one should get vaccinated with using MMR. And it took 12 years for the Lancet to actually redact that article. By that time, the damage was done, and they had an uptick in mumps, measles, and rubella in London because of essentially that particular study, right? And so that is sort of the dangers of that. And there was a scathing article written in New England Journal of Medicine, or one of them, where they said, look, if we don't attend to these things quicker and get on top of this, it's going to be worse. I think we can appreciate that. Okay, so in our thinking about this, we were concentrated on pseudoscience, right? And so pseudoscience is appropriating claims to seem more scientific, but there's other sort of types of misinformation and disinformation. So misinformation is just getting facts wrong. A lot of times they talk about filter bubbles or biases where you get your information, and then disinformation where it's false information that's deliberate. A great example of this is like deep fakes. I have a son who's in elementary school, so I am familiar with YouTubers more than I want to be. But one of the YouTubers' names is Mr. Beast, and he is known for his philanthropic activities. Well, someone did a deep fake where they used basically it's an adversarial AI network, take pictures of someone, get the actual computer to generate pictures that are similar, and then after time, the computer can generate pictures that are just as good, and then they animate them. So they animated a picture of this fellow who does this philanthropic stuff, and had people say he's going to give away free iPhones. You just need to give $2, and scammed all these people out of money, right? So you can see the application of this stuff is pretty it's applicable in our world like right now. That happened less than a year ago, I think. So I describe these as sort of the Neapolitan falsehoods. Just like the different flavors of ice cream, we're dealing with the fallout of these in multiple areas of our lives. And like pseudoscience information that uses science, these actually use news and social media as a way to garner credibility. Okay. So, and then I'm going to talk about this at the end because this is where we're headed with the work. You know, what I would argue is that the social media has basically increased the speed, the scale, and the massive proliferation and consumption of basically false news. And during the pandemic, the World Health Organization talked about something as an infodemic, right? So types of things that were documented as being, medically sound, or injecting oneself with bleach, drinking acutely poisonous methanol, using a USB stick to shield you from the electronic version of the virus, wearing masks actually activate the virus. That Bill Gates was planning to use the COVID to put microchips in us. It goes on and on. So I would humbly argue the research we're conducting now is timely, and vaccine beliefs is something that we need to spend some time on. I think at this point, it's not just in health news. I think it's all over. And you're seeing that the new president for psychonomics is Stephen Lewandowski. Most of his career in the last 10 years has been working on this stuff. Okay, so what is our question about this? Well, we want to see how science is conveyed in a text. And I'm talking about like the syntax of science. Forgive it, I'm using syntax in a way that's probably not appropriate, but we're looking at not changing the claims themselves, but the way the claims are packaged, the form the claims take. And what we did is essentially look at 3 things in how basically pseudoscience is conveyed in the internet, and getting people to make assessments of how scientific that stuff is, how credible that is, and how it might change their actual beliefs, right? So what we did is we scoured the internet for pseudoscience types of beliefs where it included um, essentially, equipment. It has theories. It has the trappings of basically science. And these are things like learning styles, which I mentioned already, right? That your teaching matches people's preferences, graphology, left brain, right brain, homeopathy, creation science, thought field therapy, astrological healing, magnet therapy, numerology, and water dowsing. We collected basically internet snippets of these things where people were promoting them. One of my favorites, by the way, is water dowsing. And I'm not going to show this, but and for people who aren't aware, this is available on Amazon for $30. This is a water dowsing set. These are copper, and the idea is you hold these things, and through magic, you find water in the ground. It is beyond that now that these are used by folks to find people's lost rings, bicycles, family members. And this actual video, you guys can view it at your leisure, is a woman who purports to be a doctor who's not, who talks about basically false information in pseudoscience. They use jargon. They use claims that are facts, like how much water is in the human body, but that's like a vehicle for then what the lie is. There's a measurement. There's specific alluring detail. And if you go to that video, you see that this is a Zoom video where 100 people attended it. And then there are no less than 15 dowsing chapters in the United States. So basically, we want to see how these claims taken from the internet would fare if we scaffold them with basically the trappings and the story grammars and the packaging of science. Okay. So this is an example of one of the actual texts that were taken from the internet about learning styles, where we have removed people's identifying information to protect the guilty and made changes to it. So this was essentially the control condition. This is what someone would read. And then we changed things like, you can see here, we added APA referencing. That's all we did. That was one of the conditions. And another condition, all we added was basically an appeal to the fact that the person has some sort of advanced degree. The degrees are almost made up in all cases. Okay. And then we had one where we changed the nature of how the language was either hedged or absolute. Here we say the word proves. That should, for folks who are, adroit, suggest, I don't know, that's a pretty strong word. This might not be true. And contrast that with how we might hedge language in science may provide support or might facilitate, right? So our hypotheses essentially were, oh, did I put those in there? I did, but the next slide. Oh, I took it out, maybe. Okay, so our hypotheses were that essentially credentialing and providing APA references would make things seem more credible and more scientific, and that hedging language would also be seen as more scientific and more credible. All right, we ran a within subjects design. They read 10 of these. We had a control condition where there wasn't any changes to it, and counterbalance the order and all the fixings, and then all the follow-up Bonferroni and Tukey's and such. Okay. Oh, and this is really important when you're doing this kind of work, is to make sure that you debrief students about what we were doing. And you will, yeah, really important. Because if we actually change their beliefs, that would be terrible. Okay. So in the actual experiment, they provided a Likert rating of their beliefs on these topics, like, graphology, learning styles, water dowsing. And, it's a 1 to 7 scale, and the averages were in between. There are people who believe this and people that don't. There was enough variability in the data of belief. And these are undergraduate students in the College of Education. They're in the participant pool. Okay. They rated how much they personally believe the claim. Then they rated the scientific end of the passage that they read. They rated its credibility. And at the end of that, then they rated their ability, a sort of post-belief. They rated whether they personally believe the claim as a function of what they read. Okay. Okay, these are hypotheses. I just went through those, so I won't take extra time with that. Okay, these are the results. So as expected, and there's some other people who did this in Germany. Thom did this with basically diabetes and dementia, and he created essentially experiments out of facts and dramatically changed people's basically assessments of science, but didn't contain a lot about what then changes were in belief. Okay, So that's what I think we're trying to add here. So we see strong effects of controls versus references, and control versus credential name. Adding references, adding credentials names changed people's scientificness. It was seen as being much more scientific. It was also seen as being much more credible if you had references and credential names. The absolute versus uncertain language, there was no results whatsoever. Didn't happen. Nothing happened there. So here's what it looks like. So in this instance, this is a 1 to 7 scale. If you read something and references are included, that's a 17% gain in the 7-point scale, right? Or is that one 14? That one's 14. The next one's 17, I think. Yeah, that's right. Right. But this is pretty substantial. The effect sizes are large. So people really do believe when you add citations that it's a scientific piece of information. And when you add people's degrees, right? But we didn't change anything about the meaning of these things, right? So let me ask then, what do you think? Were we able to push around people's beliefs? Our hypothesis is that we would slightly change people's beliefs and that scientific sort of trappings would help to increase that. What do people think?
I'd say no.
Yeah, you're right. Belief change is really hard. And so what happened there, okay, this is for credentialing, you see even larger effects. You're right. Didn't change at all. No change whatsoever. Okay. And of course, it's difficult to change people's beliefs. We know about the literature and conceptual change, but it's really interesting in my mind, the disconnect between, hey, this is super scientific and this is credible, but I don't believe it. And what does that disconnect mean? So here were some of the conclusions about that, and that led to our further work that we're doing right now that I want to talk about a little bit, and then we'll, move on. Um, so the good thing is that referencing and using authority increase scientificness, right? Those things are important, I guess. And people did think that science should drive belief, but not necessarily their beliefs, maybe others' beliefs. The bad, they were convinced of the scientificness and credibility of claims that was usually like the syntax of it, the rules, the trappings. We did not actually change any claims made in the content we took from the internet. Here's the thing that's really ugly about it, I think, is there's no relationship between students knowing how science is packaged and then using science to assess their own beliefs, which makes me think that beliefs may have a privileged status. I can assess things, for others, but it doesn't really count for me. Or, to be honest, a mistake on my part. I made the classic mistake of taking a worldview of a researcher, right? I believe that science should inform your beliefs, but that may not be what other people believe, correct? Okay. So one of the things we moved on from there was looking at basically vaccine beliefs. And so one of the things we're interested in is why do people hold these beliefs? Where do they come from? And then cognitively, can we get a handle on essentially the underpinning of them? So we did a quick and dirty survey on MTurk, which MTurk is good for, looking at essentially what the difference is between people who did have concerns about the COVID vaccines and people who didn't. So we asked you, do you have a concern? And if they say yes, then they explain their concerns. But if people said no, they didn't have a concern, we had them answer the question, why do you think other people might be concerned about vaccines? And what we saw was an interesting flip in the data. And I don't know, I'm going to have to do some work on this because it's not a very big N, but it's interesting. It's like if you think that you have a concern about vaccines, then you're more likely to list that the long-term effects or side effects, which I would characterize as fear of the unknown, but also some conspiracy theory. But if you don't have any concerns about vaccine, you believe that people who do have concerns are essentially more likely to engage in thoughts about the lack of trust of the government and its efficacy and more conspiratorial things, less about the fear of sort of the unknown. So what we're trying to do is figure out where people fall in terms of their beliefs. And what we're going to do is essentially take an approach from Lewandowski, which is basically technocognition. I'll talk about that in a minute. So one of the things they've come up with this idea of debunking handbook, and in this they present the correct information, what the misinformation might be, what the actual like myth is that's sold. This is on global warming. There is a group that's created the Oregon Petition Project where they get all these scientists to sign this, and anybody can be a scientist. Apparently, Darwin was on there as one of the Spice Girls as someone else. And then they say, this is basically people who say climate change doesn't exist. And so this is one approach that they've come up with. Unfortunately, there are recent research from some folks in Ireland that suggests this doesn't work either. And so one of the things we're looking at now is essentially applying this idea of technocognition, where essentially you are in real time assessing people's beliefs and getting the idea of their cognition behind that, and then sort of like getting a sense of the different elements that make that up. So, and I think it's not an overstatement, but if I say this, it does kind of fit, right? A false belief based on incorrect information about external reality that is firmly sustained despite what almost everyone else believes, and despite what constitutes incontrovertible and obvious proof or evidence to the contrary. This is actually DSM's definition of delusion. And we're not saying these folks are delusional, but this is such a pervasive thing that we may need to revisit the types of work that's done in that area and in psychiatry. And this is where like Brian and I are talking. And so one of the things we've looked at is the Brown Assessment of Belief Scale, where this is used for folks who have like a fear of flying, and it's like sort of cognitive behavioral therapy. And so what it measures is your conviction in the belief, your perception of others' views of the belief, explaining different views, your fixity, the attempt to disprove ideas, and then your insight, like what caused you to hold those beliefs, and do those for different things that we know are harmful and maybe conspiratorial, and see where that's going. There's a lot of folks in psychology, in discourse processes like David Rapp, Lewandowski. I'm trying to think of some of the others that have sort of moved their work to this because it seems to be something where people are really concerned. So I have here a picture of this. Is for you guys old enough, they're these old choose your own adventure. And so this experiment is taking a different turn because what we're going to be doing in these choose your own adventure books, you choose something and then you go to a next page and the story changes. And so we would be doing the same thing with this, where we'd be like, well, what is your choice about your belief about these? And then providing information to help people to get good information about different topic areas, right? And so that is another area of work.